The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sound that had become the white noise of Laura Bennett's entire life. 3 a.m. at Oak Creek Memorial in Houston meant the ER operated in that strange twilight between the chaos of evening and the false peace of pre-dawn. The overhead panels cast everything in a color that didn't exist in nature, a kind of surgical white that made skin look gray and blood look darker than it actually was. Laura moved through Trauma Bay with the efficiency of someone who had been moving through trauma bays for 18 months straight, her scrubs faded to the shade of old denim, her badge clipped to the collar with the kind of careful precision that suggested she'd done it exactly the same way every shift for a very long time. She wasn't the kind of nurse people noticed. Not because she was unremarkable, her hands moved with the kind of muscle memory that suggested they had done far more complicated things than checking vitals and running labs, but because she had spent 18 months making herself into the kind of person it was easy to look through. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a way that didn't frame her face. Her voice, when she spoke, never rose above the tone of a question. She wore compression gloves without explanation, her wrists wrapped with athletic tape under her sleeves, and if anyone in the hospital knew why a night shift ER nurse wore the same style of watch that military divers wore, nobody had ever asked her about it. What nobody knew was that Laura Bennett had a Navy cross folded in a box under her bed at home. 2 silver stars, neatly stacked beside it. A Purple Heart from a roadside bomb in Kandahar that had killed 3 of her teammates but had only taken 2 fingers' worth of mobility from her right hand, hence the compression gloves, the therapy she did on her breaks, the way she had to stretch her wrists before any shift that involved for placement. What nobody knew was that Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett had served her country for 12 years across 2 tours that had broken something in her that she was still not sure could be fixed. The nightmares had started in year 9. By year 12, they were her only consistent companion. Images that came without warning. The smell of diesel and blood. Teammates' names that her brain refused to stop shouting at 3 in the morning. A sound, something between a scream and an alarm, that would jolt her awake gasping, her hands already reaching for a weapon she no longer carried. She had gone to the Veterans Affairs Clinic once, filled out a form that asked her to rate her trauma on a scale of 1 to 10, and then she had walked out before anyone could call her name. The form was still in her car, unsigned, filed between the seats like a confession she would never make. So she had made a choice. A quiet choice. A choice that felt less like courage and more like self-preservation dressed up as maturity. She had submitted her medical discharge paperwork, and she had not told anyone where she was going. Not her commander, not her family, not the people she had bled beside in rooms exactly like this one but with very different consequences. She had driven to Houston because she had driven south and kept driving, and Houston was where the gas tank had been low enough and the hospital was desperate enough that they hadn't asked too many questions about the gaps in her employment history. The hiring manager had barely looked up from her paperwork. Laura had been exactly what Oak Creek Memorial needed: quiet, competent, never complained, and completely invisible to administration. For 18 months, that had been enough. She had worked nights specifically because nights meant fewer supervisors. Fewer board members doing rounds. Fewer people who might recognize something in the way she moved or the way her hands responded to crisis that shouldn't be there in someone who'd spent the last decade working retail and odd jobs. She had built a life in the margins of other people's emergencies, pushing them back from the edge, and then going home to an apartment that was so carefully maintained it barely looked lived in. The only artifact of her former life was the jacket. It hung in her closet, a leather flight jacket worn soft by years, and inside the lining was a unit patch, small, maybe 3 inches square, the 75th Ranger Regiment's insignia in faded thread. She kept it there like a rosary, something she could touch without having to look at it, a reminder that she had been someone, once. That somewhere in this version of herself there was still something that answered to the name she had left behind. What Laura did not know, as she moved through those pre-dawn hours with her full lines and her vital signs monitors and her careful, meticulous charting, was that her very competence had made her dangerous to someone else. Dr. Marcus Hargrove ran the emergency department at Oak Creek Memorial with the kind of smooth authority that came from knowing exactly how to work the system. He was a handsome man in the way doctors often were: expensive watch, tailored coat, the kind of smile that had been specifically designed to make people trust him. He had been the ER director for 6 years, and in those 6 years he had built something very profitable on the side. Shell companies with names like Efficient Care Consulting and Premier Trauma Solutions. His companies provided billing services to Oak Creek Memorial, services that somehow always resulted in duplicate charges, phantom consultations, and unnecessary tests that appeared in patient records with his referral codes attached. It was a good system. It had made him nearly $400,000 last year alone. But systems required silence, and silence required that nobody look too closely at the numbers. The problem with Laura Bennett was that she looked. Not on purpose. Not because she was suspicious or investigative. But because 18 months of military medical training had left her with habits that were difficult to break. She charted everything. Vitals at arrival, vitals at 5-minute intervals, notations about what had actually been done versus what appeared in the system. The kind of meticulous record-keeping that had saved lives in field hospitals, but that was starting to raise uncomfortable questions with the billing department about why there were discrepancies between what Laura's note said had occurred and what the system showed had been billed. Hargrove had noticed. 2 weeks ago, he had pulled a random sample of charts from nights when Laura was working. Comparing her nursing notes to the billing records. Matching her timestamps to his consultation codes. The numbers did not align. More importantly, the patterns in his phantom consults seemed to happen on nights when Laura was not working, and seemed to not happen on nights when she was. Which suggested that if he continued to rely on her documentation, someone eventually was going to ask why Laura's patient data was so accurate and so consistently different from what had actually been charged to insurance. She had to go. Not immediately. Not in a way that would draw attention. But systematically, and soon. Hargrove had made those kinds of decisions before. He was making one now, at 3:47 a.m., as he watched Laura through the glass partition of Trauma Bay 4, her hand steady as she adjusted and foredrip, her face illuminated by the monitor light. He was thinking about how to make it happen. How to make her just uncomfortable enough that she would leave on her own. And if that didn't work, how to make it look like she was the problem. The fluorescent lights hummed. Laura's hands moved. And neither of them knew that in less than 36 hours, everything that had been carefully buried would start clawing its way back to the surface. The nurses' station at Oak Creek Memorial fell quiet at 11:41 p.m. when Dr. Hargrove walked in carrying a clipboard and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Laura was charting at the far end of the counter, her handwriting precise and small, each note documented with the kind of detail that made her dangerous to people like him. He looked at her the way a man might study a problem he'd already decided to solve. "Listen up," Hargrove announced, loud enough that every nurse within 30 feet turned to look. "I've got a wager for anyone interested. $20 says our meticulous Ms. Bennett here quits within a week. She's not built for night shift. Too quiet. Too intense. She'll crack." He smiled at the other nurses. "Anyone want action on that?" 3 nurses laughed. One, Rachel, a blonde resident who'd aligned herself with Hargrove months ago, grinned. "I'll take that bet, doctor. She's tougher than she looks." "Oh, I don't think so," Hargrove said, still holding Laura's gaze. "I think all this composure is theater. One good push and she'll realize she doesn't belong here." Laura didn't look up from her charting. Her pen didn't hesitate. She turned the page, made a note in the next column, and continued working. The absence of a reaction seemed to irritate him more than any defensive response would have. He stood there for another 3 seconds, waiting for something, anger, tears, a confrontation, and when nothing came, he walked away with his clipboard clutched against his chest. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, the cafeteria at 2:18 a.m. was nearly empty. Laura stood in the serving line with her tray, collecting the items she'd need to survive another 10 hours, coffee, a salad, a protein bar. She was reaching for the register when Dr. Hargrove came around the corner carrying his own tray, walking deliberately toward her with the kind of casual momentum that couldn't have been accidental. He was 2 feet away when he'd stumbled. His tray collided with hers in a gesture so obviously intentional that even the cafeteria worker flinched. Food cascaded across the tile floor, salad dressing pooling around her shoes, coffee spreading like spilled blood, the plate shattering against the linoleum with a sound that echoed through the empty space. "Oh, clumsy me," Hargrove said, his voice coated in false concern. "So sorry. These late nights get to everyone eventually. You should really think about getting some rest." Laura looked at the mess. She looked at her scrubs, now stained with vinaigrette. She looked at Hargrove's face, smug, testing, waiting for her to react. Around them, 2 other nurses watched in uncomfortable silence. The cafeteria worker pretended to reorganize the pastry case. "I'll clean it up," Laura said quietly. "That's the spirit," Hargrove replied, moving past her toward the coffee station. "See? Not so bad. You're learning." She grabbed paper towels and began wiping the floor methodically, each motion controlled and deliberate. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. But the other nurses exchanged glances that suggested they'd seen something they weren't comfortable witnessing, and they left without speaking to her. The worst came 3 days later during afternoon rounds. Laura was presenting a patient chart to Hargrove when he snatched it from her hands mid-sentence, scanned the pages for maybe 2 seconds, and threw it at her feet. The paper scattered across the tile like fallen leaves. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying the contempt of a man accustomed to never being challenged. "And next time, try charting like you actually went to nursing school instead of picked it up from a library book." The room went dead silent. 6 other staff members froze. A respiratory therapist stood in the doorway, caught between the urge to look away and the compulsion to witness what happened next. 2 residents exchanged glances that contained something between pity and fear. Laura knelt down and began collecting the scattered pages, moving with the unhurried precision of someone who had decided, long ago, that the only power available to her was the power of her own composure. She picked up the last page. She stood. She looked at Dr. Hargrove with eyes that had seen things his comfortable, arrogant life would never touch. And then she spoke, her voice low enough that only he and the closest staff members could hear. "My son is in Kandahar right now," she said, each word placed like a tile. "He's with the 75th Ranger Regiment, and he's there because men like you get to play doctor in safety. So you can throw charts and knock over trays and make your little bets about when I'll break. But I won't. Not for you." A single tear ran down her cheek. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, the gesture economical and controlled, the kind of thing a person does when they've already cried 1,000 times and learned how to do it quietly. "Is that clear, Doctor?" Hargrove's face flushed. His jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, recognizing something in her that his social attacks couldn't reach. Without a word, he turned and walked away, muttering something about unprofessional behavior that no one actually heard. The residents went back to their paperwork. The respiratory therapist finished her delivery and left. The moment passed, sealed shut, and Laura stood alone with the pages of the scattered chart. Rachel, the blonde nurse, approached her carefully a few minutes later. "That was..." She paused, searching for words. "That was incredible. I've never heard you talk about anything personal." "I don't usually," Laura said, filing the chart. "I prefer to work." "Well, whatever you just did, you got to him. I've never seen him that quiet." But Laura already knew the truth that Rachel didn't. Hargrove hadn't given up. He'd only shifted tactics. Men like him didn't accept failure, they adapted to it. And now he knew exactly which pressure points to exploit, the hidden past, the hidden family, the hidden identity that Laura had spent 18 months building like a wall around herself. What happened next would prove that some walls, no matter how carefully constructed, could be breached by someone willing to use the right tools. 3 nights later, at 3:06 a.m., the first patient arrived through the emergency bay doors. The stretcher rolled through the bay doors at 3:06 a.m., wheels squeaking against the polished floor. The paramedics moved with practiced urgency, their voices clipped and efficient as they called report to the waiting team. "A male patient, mid-50s, unconscious, severe laceration to the left ribcage from a motor vehicle accident on Interstate 10. Blood-soaked gauze. 2 large borefores running wide open. Oxygen mask fogging with each shallow breath. Laura was already moving before the attending physician looked up from the computer. Night shift at Oak Creek Memorial meant she'd learned to read the tone of a paramedic's voice the way a sailor reads wind direction. This one had urgency in his cadence. The kind that meant they were racing a clock nobody was announcing out loud. The trauma bay smelled like diesel fuel and antiseptic. That particular combination that meant someone had been pulled from wreckage. Bay 3, she called out, not asking. She was already stripping on gloves, her movements economical and precise. The patient had no identification. No wallet. No phone. Nothing but the clothes he'd been cut out of and a jacket soaked with blood the paramedics had placed in a biohazard bag. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway, still wearing yesterday's cologne and today's arrogance. He moved toward the stretcher with the casual confidence of a man who had never once questioned his own competence. Laura kept her head down, focusing on the monitor leads as the patient was transferred to the hospital bed. She began cutting away his shirt methodically, her trauma shears moving with the muscle memory of someone who had done this in conditions far worse than a climate-controlled trauma bay. The fabric fell away in pieces. Blood. More blood. And then, as she cleared the left ribcage, she saw it. A 75th Ranger Regiment tattoo. Faded but unmistakable. An Army Ranger scroll with the distinctive scroll work that marked the elite. Her breath caught. Just once. Just enough that no one heard it over the ventilator hiss. Laura's hands did not tremble. They kept moving. Training superseded shock. She reached for the jacket in the biohazard bag, evidence protocol, something to do with her hands while her mind recalibrated. The lining was torn from the accident, and as she gently opened it to inspect for identification, she felt something sewn into the interior fabric. A patch. Military issue. She pulled it carefully from the stitching. The 75th Ranger Regiment patch. Same unit as David's. Same insignia her son had shown her in a photograph 3 years ago when she pretended to understand what it meant while actually understanding everything. The room seemed to contract around her. Time did something strange. Her hands moved through the next sequence of steps, vitals, for adjustment, medication draw-up, but part of her consciousness was somewhere else entirely, in a memory of David at 17, showing her a photograph of his commanding officer, Major Chen, with casual pride in his voice. Best leader in the battalion. If I'm ever in trouble, I want him in the room with me. She looked at the unconscious man on the table. Mid-50s. The right age. The right unit. The surgical cut of his jaw matched the photograph David had shown her years ago. Major Chen. Her son's commanding officer was bleeding out on her table. Laura registered the blood pressure reading on the monitor without looking at it directly. 72/40. Dropping. The oxygen saturation bounced at 81%. The man's breathing was shallow, labored. She'd seen this presentation before, too many times. The penetrating trauma to the ribcage, the sudden decompensation. Cardiac tamponade. Blood collecting in the pericardial sac, compressing the heart, suffocating it from the outside. "Get me an ultrasound machine," she said. Her voice had changed. Dropped half an octave. No inflection. No request in it. Dr. Hargrove looked up from the monitor he'd been studying with the focused intensity of a man who believed he was thinking harder than everyone else. "We're stabilizing him first. Standard protocol." Laura was already moving to the bedside cart, pulling equipment. Pericardial effusion. Tamponade. "He's coding in for minutes if we don't decompress." "I've got this," Hargrove said. The tone suggested she should step back. She didn't step back. The ultrasound probe was in her hand before the machine finished booting. She placed it at the xiphoid process with practiced precision, watching the screen. There. The pericardial sac. Fluid. Too much fluid. The heart compressed like a fist closing around its own blood. I need a pericardiocentesis tray, she said. I said I have this, Hargrove repeated, his voice carrying the warning of a man unused to being contradicted by someone who wore scrubs for $40 an hour. Laura turned to look at him. Eye contact. Still. Measured. Your 4 minute started 40 seconds ago, doctor. The needle goes in subxiphoid, at a 30-degree angle, aspirating as it advances. Or he dies while you argue with me. Your choice. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator breathing for the man on the table. Hargrove moved. Not because he recognized the expertise. Because in that moment, with her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, he recognized something else entirely. Authority. The kind that didn't come from a hospital badge or a medical degree. Laura's hands moved on their own. An 18-gauge needle. She palpated the angle, felt the anatomy beneath her fingers like reading Braille. The needle advanced. Subxiphoid approach. She felt the resistance change as the pericardium gave way, and then the hiss of air escaping as the pressure released. Dark blood flowed into the syringe. 1, 2, 3 milliliters. The cardiac monitor shifted. The oxygen saturation climbed. 75. 82. 88. 92%. Stable. His heart rate, which had been racing in the 90s, slowed to 81. Sinus rhythm, she said quietly, reading the monitor. The words came out in the clipped terminology of someone who had done this in field hospitals where time was measured in statistics and every second was a life or death accounting. The team froze. All of them staring at her. A night shift ER nurse, in an open trauma bay, delivering a pericardiocentesis with the precision of someone who had performed it on combat casualties in places where the nearest surgeon was 3,000 miles away. And then the unit patch she'd found in his jacket lining was still in her gloved hand. Someone call ICU for bed assignment, Laura said, her voice already returning to its normal register, slipping back down into the appropriate register for someone who was supposed to be just an ER nurse. And we need a name. Get a DNA kit. Contact Army Human Resources. We have a 75th Ranger Regiment soldier with no identification. She placed the patch gently on the corner of the work tray. No one moved toward it. Dr. Hargrove's face had gone the color of old bone. The needle slid between the ribs like instinct returning. Third intercostal space, midclavicular line. The exact spot her hands had found 1,000 times before, in desert sand and under field hospital canvas. Chen's blood pressure had collapsed to 58/32. The monitor sang a flatline lullaby. Cardiac tamponade. Blood pooling around his heart, crushing it. 18 months of being just a nurse evaporated in 4 seconds. I need a 14-gauge angiocath, Laura said. Her voice had changed. The pitch dropped. The speed dropped. Command lived in every syllable now. A med student fumbled for the tray. Now, please. Not a question. A directive. Her hands moved on their own. Muscle memory does not sleep. It waits. The needle advanced. She felt the subtle pop as it breached the pericardium, that small resistance giving way. Air hissed from the syringe. The sound was prayer and weapon fused into one. 40 milliliters of blood. 60. The monitors shifted. The rhythm stuttered. Then it steadied. Sinus rhythm, the trauma resident whispered. The room held its breath. O2 saturation climbed. 78, 82. 88, Chen's color shifted from the gray of the nearly dead to something approaching human. His chest rose with actual air. Laura did not lower the needle. Her eyes stayed fixed on the monitor. Her shoulders remained level. No trembling. No relief spilling across her face. Just a woman who had done what the moment demanded, the way a tide answers the moon. That was when Dr. Hargrove saw the needle in her hand. He stood in the doorway, coat unbuttoned, papers scattered on a nearby counter, face the color of old bone. His eyes locked on the syringe. On her. On the way the entire trauma team had repositioned around her like she had always belonged at the center. Like she had always been the one making the call. His jaw moved but no sound came. Just a low grinding noise, like gears forced backward. Who authorized this? His voice cracked on the second word. Laura did not look at him. His left main coronary was compromised. Fluid was compressing. I asked who gave you authorization. No one had to. She withdrew the needle with the same precision she had inserted it. The syringe came free. The moment released her. He was dying. Hargrove moved toward her. Not walking. Stalking. The trauma resident stepped sideways. The med student became suddenly very interested in a wall. The attending physician found urgent business elsewhere. Hargrove leaned into her space, mouth tight, eyes hot with something that looked like fury but moved like fear. You do not touch this patient again. You do not enter this room. You do not. He stopped. Started again. Lower. You are done. Laura did not blink. He needs monitoring. The puncture site. Security will escort you from the building. You have 30 minutes to clear your locker. He turned to the attending. Document that she performed an unauthorized invasive procedure without physician supervision. Make sure it is clear in the record. Back to Laura. Your license is going to be scrutinized, Ms. Bennett. Thoroughly. It was not a threat. It was a promise. Within 68 minutes, the machinery of institutional power had locked into place. Hargrove worked the phone from his office like a conductor leading an orchestra of small men who owed him favors. He called Dr. Marcus Sterling, the board president, reminded him about the offshore account that had absorbed $300,000 of Sterling's discretionary fund. One conversation. 2 minutes. Sterling's voice did not sound happy on the other end, but it sounded compliant. Then came the call to Laura's references. Former supervisor at Broward Memorial in Fort Lauderdale. Hargrove's voice was oil and apology. I hate to call with concerns, but we're seeing some erratic behavior here. Unprompted interventions. Acting outside her scope. Have you noticed similar patterns? Any instability in her work? The lie was crafted so carefully it almost sounded like a question. Almost sounded concerned. By the third call, the narrative was set. Unreliable. Boundary crossing. A liability. Hargrove's outside investigator arrived at 4:13 p.m. A woman named Corrigan who kept files on 53 employees at various Houston medical facilities and charged $800 a day to build cases that usually stuck. She carried a tablet and wore the expression of someone who had seen enough institutional corruption to become immune to it. Hargrove handed her Laura's file. I need documentation of unauthorized medical decisions. Any procedure she touched. Any patient where her actions exceeded scope of practice. Find patterns. Find inconsistencies. Find something that sticks. Corrigan made a note. You know security footage shows her hands didn't shake during that procedure. Then find something else. By 5:15 p.m., Laura stood in front of her open locker. A cardboard box sat at her feet. 12 trauma shears with her initials etched into the handle. 3 pairs of compression socks. A photo of David in his deployment uniform, taken in Kandahar, forward operating base, that moment before everything got serious. Her badge sat on the shelf. She reached for it. Her hands were steady. The steadiness felt like a lie. A security guard waited by the exit. Male, young, uncomfortable. He did not make eye contact. I'm sorry. I don't make the decisions. Laura did not respond. She placed the badge in the box. Lifted the box. Walked past him. The hallway seemed longer leaving than it had seemed arriving. Every face she had worked beside for 18 months suddenly focused on their phones, their charts, anything that did not require looking at her. The rain started before she reached the cemetery. Heavy. Biblical. The kind of rain that hammered the hood of her 2008 Civic and made the world outside the windshield into an impressionist painting. Laura did not pull into a shelter. She walked to the grave, plot 47, section B, under the oak that Marcus used to say looked like it had been struck by lightning years ago and survived anyway. Marcus James Bennett. 1978 to 2019. Beloved husband. Father. Officer. The stone was granite, simple, unadorned. No military markers. He had requested no fanfare. No full honors. Just a quiet place where the rain sounded like anything other than the sound of a helicopter leaving without him. Laura stood in the downpour. Dress uniform folded in her car trunk for a funeral that was not coming. Retirement ceremony she had missed. Reunion she had skipped. All of it packed away with the part of herself she had been trying to bury for 18 months by working night shifts and keeping her head down and pretending that becoming invisible would make the nightmare stop. I failed, Marcus. Her voice was barely audible under the rain. I tried to leave it all behind and I still couldn't save what mattered. Couldn't save myself. And now I've saved someone else's life and it's going to cost me everything. The rain did not answer. The stone did not judge. She stood there in the dark, no tears, because soldiers had learned long ago that tears and rain were not compatible, and held the weight of her own composure like a weapon that had finally turned inward. Back at Oak Creek Memorial, the security footage from the trauma bay played on a loop in Hargrove's office. Frame by frame. Laura's hands entering the frame. The needle advancing. The steady pressure. The exact moment the arrhythmia resolved. Her hands moved like someone who had done this not once or twice but hundreds of times. Like someone trained. Like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Hargrove watched the footage with Corrigan standing beside him. Neither of them spoke for nearly 90 seconds. Outside, the rain continued its assault on the hospital windows. The procedure was perfect, Corrigan said quietly. Textbook. She probably saved his life. Hargrove's jaw tightened. I do not care if she saved the Pope. She violated protocol. She overstepped. Document it. I want her history combed. I want every decision questioned. There has to be something, some precedent, some variance, some indication that she has been acting outside her authority from day one. Corrigan looked at him. What if there isn't? Then we make sure the narrative is clear enough that it does not matter what the footage shows. The story is what sticks. Not the tape. The story. At 2:38 a.m., Laura sat in her car in the cemetery parking lot. The rain drummed on the metal roof. The box of her belongings sat in the passenger seat. 18 months of invisibility in a cardboard container. She pulled out the unit patch, the one she had found sewn into Chen's jacket lining. Faded. Worn. The 75th Ranger Regiment insignia. The same one David wore under his uniform. The same one she had worn before she became someone else. She held it in her palm. Considered rolling down the window and releasing it into the rain, letting it dissolve into the parking lot asphalt where no one would ever know what it meant. No one would ever know what it had cost. No one would ever need to know that she had been anything other than just a nurse, just a woman with a cardboard box and a car that needed an oil change. The patch felt impossibly heavy. Then she heard it. Distant at first. A sound she had not allowed herself to hear in 18 months. Rotor blades cutting through rain. Low. Methodical. Drawing closer. Not one helicopter. Multiple. The sound moved from theoretical to actual. From memory to present tense. Laura's fingers closed around the patch. The rotor wash began to shake the car. The rotor wash began to shake the car. Laura's fingers closed around the patch as the 3 black SUVs materialized in her rearview mirror, cutting off every exit from the cemetery parking lot. She didn't move. Military vehicles didn't surround civilians by accident. This was precision. This was purpose. A Marine colonel stepped out of the lead SUV, dress uniform creased like a knife blade, boots striking the wet asphalt with deliberate rhythm. He approached her window. She rolled it down. Rain fell sideways into the car, cold as a medevac briefing. Senior Chief Petty Officer Bennett. His voice carried the weight of command, the kind that didn't ask questions, it issued orders and waited for compliance. Laura's breath steadied. That rank. That title. 18 months of erasure. 18 months of being just another night shift nurse with shaky hands and a gravestone she visited on her worst days. The colonel had just dragged both of those identities into the parking lot and announced them to the rain. She didn't answer. She was already opening the door. The second sub's passenger door swung open. David emerged in full combat gear, body armor, magazine pouches, the 75th Ranger patch on his shoulder that matched the one her trembling fingers still held. Her son. 24 years old and already a captain, already carrying the weight of men who died under his command. His voice cracked when he stepped toward her. Senior Chief. Not Mom. Not this way. Not now. The rank came first because they both understood identity mattered more than blood right now. They both understood the language. Behind him, Major Richard Chen appeared, alive and alert, shirt wrapped in fresh bandages. His hand gripped David's shoulder as he moved forward, medical charts in his other hand. His eyes locked on hers, and she saw something in them that felt like a courtroom verdict. He began to read from the papers, voice trembling slightly, not from weakness but from the weight of speaking classified information into a cemetery parking lot in front of enlisted witnesses. Navy Cross. The rain hammered down. Nobody moved. 2 silver stars. A SEAL team leader stepped forward from the third vehicle. She recognized him immediately. Master Chief Holloway. Kandahar, 2012. An ambush near Sanjin Valley that left for Rangers bleeding out in a compound courtyard while their medevac got shredded by small arms fire. She'd gone in anyway. 12 wounded. 600 meters of open ground. 2 magazines and muscle memory older than her son. Holloway's voice carried across the parking lot like an order of battle. This woman extracted 12 wounded Rangers under fire when their medevac was shot down. Moved them cross-terrain under active engagement. 2 of those Rangers had sucking chest wounds. She used field dressings improvised from MRE packaging and her own uniform. She's the reason Major Chen and half his unit are alive today. 2 FBI agents emerged from a 4th vehicle, unmarked sedan, government plates, and walked directly past the military contingent. They didn't acknowledge the colonel or the Rangers. Their attention locked on the hospital entrance 50 meters away, on the 3rd floor administrative wing where Dr. Hargrove was at that exact moment sitting at his desk, scrolling through the hospital's personnel database with hands that weren't quite steady anymore. He'd been trying to alter Laura's employment record for 20 minutes. Adding dates. Falsifying incident reports. Creating a paper trail that would make it look like she'd been performing unauthorized procedures for months. Months before Major Chen arrived. Months before she'd even been on night shift in the trauma bay. The logic didn't matter if nobody looked too carefully. The logic never mattered when you had board members who owed you favors and administrators who understood that sometimes the truth got reorganized. The FBI agents had been watching him for 3 months. 3 months of bank records. 3 months of billing audits. 3 months of discovering that Hargrove had created 7 shell companies, billed Oak Creek Memorial for phantom consultations, and routed nearly $840,000 to accounts in Grand Cayman. The falsification of Laura's records, that was just the moment they decided to move. The agents' boots echoed through the hospital corridor. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't need to. They had federal credentials and the kind of bearing that made hospital administrators suddenly forget their own names. Hargrove looked up from his computer screen. His face went the color of hospital linoleum. Step back from the keyboard, Dr. Hargrove. One agent had her hand near her holster. The other was already photographing the screen with a government-issue phone. You're under federal investigation for healthcare fraud, and we just caught you tampering with personnel records to obstruct a personnel matter. He stood. Saturday. Stood again. His voice came out in pieces. This is a misunderstanding. I was just updating her file. Routine maintenance. At 10:53 p.m. on a Sunday. On a terminated employee. While removing a pericardiocentesis procedure from her record and falsifying the date of incident reports. The agent's voice had the flat cadence of someone reading a warrant. You have the right to remain silent. They cuffed him while he was still stammering excuses. Silver bracelets. Cold metal. The sound carried through the administrative wing like a bell announcing the end of something. Down in the parking lot, Laura watched him walk out between the agents. Past the nursing staff who'd gathered at the windows. Past the orderlies who'd seen him knock her tray across the cafeteria floor. Past the residents who'd watched him throw her chart at her feet and call her sweetheart. Past every person who'd seen her absorb humiliation with one measured breath and a single terrible moment of quiet dignity. She didn't smile. Quiet vindication didn't require a smile. It required exactly one thing, witnessing. And every nurse in that hospital was witnessing. Every pair of eyes on Hargrove as he passed was a mirror held up to his own face, and he saw himself, not as the director, not as the administrator with network and leverage and the kind of institutional power that could erase inconvenient people. He saw himself as what he actually was. Nothing important. The handcuffs clicked as the agents placed him in the sedan. His face was visible for one moment through the rear window, pale, sweating, the expression of a man who'd spent 18 months pushing on a door he thought was load-bearing, only to discover the entire structure had been plywood all along. The sedan pulled away into the Houston rain. Back in the cemetery parking lot, Laura stood with her son on one side and her son's commanding officer on the other. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke, was the voice that had ordered men into fire zones and pulled them back out again. 5 hours from arrival to full recognition. She looked at the colonel. Your people move fast. Your people vouched for you the moment Major Chen regained consciousness. The colonel's expression shifted. Not smile. Respect. He gave us the unit patch. We backtracked the security footage. Your medical intervention was exceptional. David's hand found hers. Squeezed once. I need to be clear about something, Laura said. Her voice had dropped half an octave. When she was speaking to colonels and captains and master chiefs, the timid nurse voice was just a costume she'd been wearing. It was already hanging in the closet behind her. I left that life. I chose to. The nightmares made me choose. We know, Holloway said quietly. That's why we're asking, not demanding. 2 years later, David sent her a photograph. Dr. Hargrove in an orange safety vest, sitting behind a folding table in front of a strip mall in Tucson, Arizona. Cut-rate insurance policies. His name tag read Steve. He flinched when anyone addressed him as doctor. The insurance company had hired him for the discount chain locations where nobody asked about background checks too carefully, where the pay was hourly and the customers didn't care that he'd lost his license or served 18 months on federal fraud charges. The Tucson location had the highest turnover in the company. Most people lasted 3 weeks before they realized they couldn't actually sell anything to someone who reeked of desperation and institutional failure. Laura had returned to military medicine. She'd traded the ER anonymity for a position at Walter Reed, training trauma nurses in damage control techniques, teaching the next generation how to save lives when there were no second chances. Her hands moved through demonstrations with the precision of someone who'd done this for real, under fire, with lives hanging on the speed of her fingers. The unit patch from Major Chen's jacket hung framed on her office wall. Laminated. Dated. A single photograph of her in uniform standing beside David and Holloway, all of them squinting into Kandahar sun, all of them alive because she'd made a choice 18 months ago to live quietly and hidden, and then made another choice to step back into the light. A young nurse stopped her in the corridor one afternoon, couldn't have been more than 23, fresh from her certification, wearing the uncertainty like a uniform that didn't quite fit. "Senior Chief Bennett? Can I ask you something?" The nurse's voice had that tremor. That fear. How do you come back from walking away? Laura didn't hesitate. You don't come back. You come forward. Backward is a direction for people who think their mistakes are permanent. She touched the nurse's shoulder. Just once. Your hands are steady. I watched you during the drill. You're going to be good at this. The nurse smiled and nodded and walked away, and Laura returned to the charts on her desk, to the work of training the next generation, to the war that never ended, the quiet war fought in trauma bays and in training rooms and in the hands of people who'd learned that sometimes the bravest thing you could do wasn't wear the uniform publicly. Sometimes it was wear the scrubs invisibly, heal the broken, and wait for the moment when the Pentagon finally called. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If you've ever had a boss who didn't believe in you, who tried to break you down with public humiliation, I want to know, what kept you standing? Was it pride? Dignity? The knowledge that you were better than their version of you? Drop a comment and let me know your story. And if this one hit you hard, if you found something of yourself in Laura Bennett's quiet strength, in the choice to walk away and the choice to return, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because next week, we're bringing you a story about a therapist who uncovers the real reason her clinic's director is so interested in her patient files. And let me tell you, that one goes places. Thanks for watching. Keep your hands steady.